Hello, hello, hello. Good morning, and welcome to Inclusion Re-engineered. My name is Hannah Awanuga. I'm the founder and CEO of Illume Executive Consulting, an organization that focus on three core disciplines: cultural governance, inclusive practices, and leadership development. We support high growth businesses to build cultures where people thrive and not just survive. I am so excited to be here today. We have been doing this every month. I feel really proud of myself that we have been consistent with this. And thank you to everyone who is joining us from either all of the channels that we have connected to. Today, we're exploring something that is really, really critical in today's age, and that is leadership development. We have all been on the unconscious bias training or completed the mandatory DEI training that we get in our inboxes. And although the premise is important, although the intention is important, the question that we're asking today is it really effective? And I wanted to make sure that as we really delve into this conversation, that we looked at leadership holistically. We looked at it not only from a leadership of self, which we are all leaders of ourselves, but also leadership of teams, leadership of projects, leadership of organizations, because actually we know that leadership plays such a critical part in trying to build a culture where people feel valued, respected, seen, heard. And so I'm so delighted to be joined by my good friend and Illume Faculty member, Ade Ahmadu. And Ade is a transformation specialist, an executive coach, and the founder of Cerculate. Ade, thank you so much for joining us. I know that you spent a lot of your work focusing on leadership, and so actually I felt like it was such a great topic for us to get into, because actually, you know, when we think about leaders, people often think that we are talking about, you know, big leaders of big teams, but actually you can still be a leader of a small team. It's the impact that you have across the business, isn't it? So welcome.
Hey, how's it going, Hannah? You all right? Hope you can
Yes.
hear me. Just want to make sure that
Yeah,
I'm not talking.
no, we can hear you loud and clear. How are you?
I am well. You know, it's a great weather. You know, I'm always just in good spirits, spending time with family and doing all the good things required to make someone grounded, right?
Oh, absolutely. And I take that as feedback actually. Because I probably
Yeah.
need to find ways to do grounding myself. Okay, so look, one of the things I wanted to get started with is just how leaders are appointed. Now, this is such a generalized statement, so it's not everyone's experience, but I've been a leader for about the last 15 years. And I remember my first ever leadership role was really given to me because I was great at sales. So I was great at my previous job. You know, I'd done really well. I met my targets. And then all of a sudden, I am being asked to lead a team. Now, for me, that was amazing because I love people, I love development, but that doesn't work all the time. And I think sometimes people feel like if you're good at your job, if you've got high performance, then you automatically can be a leader. I don't know. You answer first because I have my own views on this. But what do you think?
Do you know, I understand where you're getting at. You know, someone performs well in their job, and the natural progression is, you know, you get better, promotion. Hey, become a leader, become a manager, and I think those are the natural steps that happen in the workplace, and that's great. That shows progression. I think where we find some issues is, for example, there are technical excellence is one thing, but leadership is a completely different thing. And I want to base the premise of my conversation today on a definition that I kind of came across recently when just doing a strategic leadership sort of like executive course. And it was the ability to influence, right? Intentionally influence other people or organizations towards an outcome. And that's what leadership was defined as. And so when we see that, you know, influence and gathering people is the crux of leadership in that definition, and there's various other definitions, you can see where there's gaps in someone being technically good in their job, but then being put into a leadership role, which is a lot of bigger, wider scope. And so where organizations promote performance and don't train or are not even conscious of the gaps that someone might have from a leadership point of view, you might start to see bottlenecks and encounter issues with that, what we call individual contributor now becoming a manager at a higher level, which can lead to failures in ways that can kind of maybe work against that individual. So, like, I've looked at some stats, and I think it's always important to draw on these, not because stats are important, but because they kind of the context behind them. So 90% of organizations, they report leadership, in leadership capability gaps, and this was a HR trend report that was done in 2026, right? And we're talking about, so 90% of workforce that's promoted into leadership roles, there's the leadership gaps. How much time are we giving these leaders to cover these gaps? I'm sure you've gone into positions where you've gone into leadership roles. I mean, like, let's talk about the dynamic where you're working with colleagues and all of a sudden you're now becoming leader in that environment. How do you even communicate with that person that you used to go to lunch with, and now you've got to start doing performance reviews and other stuff? It's technically different, right? And so there are support systems that are also required outside of just training that individual, aspects of around, like, okay, who is actually going to be that leadership buddy, that mentor, that's someone who can coach that individual. And sometimes people use mentor and coach interchangeably, but they are significantly two different things. And a mentor is someone who might be advanced and ahead of you in their career or in a specific position to try and share some of their knowledge. But a coach is someone who asks the right strategic questions to extract answers for how you can move forward. And it's action-based, right? So for me, I'm always conscious around how someone is proactively developing their leadership skills, which, it's not about just hiring someone who is technically good. And leadership is not just about, when you get into that role, I need to hire more people like me. What's really important about leadership is how you get people who think differently to you and bring different perspectives that can help to shape, challenge, and prune your leadership in a way that helps you progress, and helps you, progress the organization forward.
Absolutely. And I think for, even when you were talking there, that earlier bit you mentioned about individual contributor based, versus being a leader. Actually, there are many people that I know who are really comfortable individually contributing to the organization, and they do it exceptionally well. I feel like people don't recognize leadership as a skill in itself, right? And so if you don't recognize that leadership is a skill, then you automatically assume that because you were a great individual contributor, you'd be a great leader. But we know that leadership requires a whole different skill set. It's empathy, it's compassion, it's strategy, it's vision. And so, I remember one of my leadership roles. A leader told me, she said, "Hannah, you're a tactical leader, not a strategic leader." Mate, it was a blow. Yeah, exactly that. It was such a blow to me. You know what? Don't get me wrong, actually, there was an element of me that appreciated it. And it was, maybe 10 years ago now. There was an element of me that appreciated the honesty, because I probably was tactical, right? I'm a high performer. So get shit done was that's my motto, right? Like, let's just get it done and do it to a high standard. But actually, what she was saying is, as a leader, that posture has to change. She was saying, as a leader, you now have to, you're now not worried about, what you're doing on a day-to-day basis, but actually how you are sharing the vision, sharing the strategy, leading people. And so I loved that the definition you gave about intentional, making intentional steps, because I think, if you got into a leadership role, and obviously we're on LinkedIn, right? So there's going to be people on this live who are just stepping into their first leadership role. I get messages all the time from, particularly women who say, look, I'm just about to step into my first leadership role. How do I act? Girl, do not be acting. There's an element of be yourself with skill. I say that quite a lot, right? But also don't take leadership as a given. Don't take it as, because I've got the role, I am now a leader. Actually, it takes real development and support, right? And so, tying it back to inclusion and culture and, all of them great stuff. Have you ever had an unconscious bias training?
Well,
here we go.
Yes, I've had unconscious bias training, which I find quite interesting. So I'll answer the first question. I have. Okay. Is there a follow-on from that?
what? I'm just about to drag it through the mud. So no, no. Do you know what? Unconscious bias training has a place. It is a
Yeah,
component within a suite of development.
yeah,
I think what we've seen over the last 15 years is that it was used as a plug hole for inclusion. You know, people would just say, let's put you on unconscious bias training, and then you are no longer biased.
yeah, yeah.
Right.
Um,
And then what was helpful, sorry, what was
no,
helpful was that actually then we had research. So research then came out and said unconscious bias is not actually effective to change bias. And then you saw a lot of organizations then move into other forms of training. We, you know, at Barclays, when I was there, we moved to conscious inclusion, which I really loved. You know, being consciously inclusive about your behaviors and your actions. But yeah, look, sorry, I cut you off. What's your thoughts on unconscious bias?
no, really good. I look, I think on the premise that we're trying to solve a problem that's never been solved before, everyone's just trying their bit, right? So, like, this is the foundation of everything we're trying to do. So, there is no playbook that we're dragging for. We're doing trial and error, and we're trying to fail quickly. Is what I really think we should be doing, so that we can learn from it quickly. I think the unconscious bias training had all good intentions. I think what it materialized to is a tick box exercise,
Yeah.
where someone has done exercise, and we could say 95% of our workforce has done unconscious bias training, and then what? What's the so what of that? And I think that's always missing. And really, you know, I laugh because obviously I've done a research paper on this, and it's around, and it includes bias as part of that paper. But the crux of the whole bias conversation is that someone identifies they have a bias in the first place, which I think is really important. I think what's really important, something I unearthed from studies as well, is that we can never eradicate our biases.
No.
And so at best, all we can really seek to do is neutralize it and bring it to the forefront of, like, how do I compensate this? So we talk about polarities being conflicting things, right? So it's not like, oh, I solve my bias and all of a sudden everything's good. It's like, no, I've got a bias. How do I manage that bias? How do I show up to the workplace, for example, as a black male? You know, what are some of my biases having grown up in the black African culture? It might be that if I see another black guy, I might try to go and spud him, you know, for you know, use of a better term. But he might want to give me a handshake.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden, I've got to come to the workplace and I've got to use my better judgment to read the room, understand, oh, I've got a bias of where I've come from. Just because someone might come from a Nigerian descent doesn't mean they want to talk in how I want to talk. So it's coming to that situation. And that's within my own community, by the way. And then so then you start to see how complex bias is, full stop. And what we need from leadership is empathy and always learning mindset. Because an empathetic leader who is always learning says, right, what don't I know? Right? Because that leadership isn't about what you know and capitalizing on it. That's great because you know that. It's about, like, what are my gaps that I need to quickly fill in here? What perspectives don't I have? And who can help me give those perspectives? So leadership is about putting the right people around you. And then lastly, it's around making sure that, okay, great, now I've learned this. Like, what are the lived experiences and what is the impact of any scenario? That means I might have to shift my leadership approach here. And that's where you step away from equality and start stepping into equity. Because what you're saying now is ABC needs X, Y needs, you know, 1, 2, 3. You might not even need letters, you need numbers. And then leadership is showing up. And so an always learning leader in an environment that, you know, you could do unconscious bias training, but the leader who goes further says, right, what do I need to start breaking down in my mindset and kind of neutralize to then have an understanding for the environment that I'm leading in.
Wow.
I know I can go on tangents. I wanted to bring it back in just to make sure it's answered.
No, like, really critical points, right? And like, devil's advocate, someone might say, oh, empathy, you don't need empathy as a leader, you know, you just need to, you know, hit your targets and grow the business. And so I've always felt like there's this there's this perceived conflict, right, with you know, being a good human being and having empathy and having compassion and business performance. But there is absolutely not. Now, don't get me wrong, you know, you have to have business acumen. You need to understand strategy and growth and transformation and acquisition. You have to understand that, because when you can understand that, you can then apply your better judgment as a good human to that, right? Because I remember, over the years, there's some leaders that have leaned in more to empathy, care, or respect, integrity, all of them things, and it has sometimes felt like, oh, they're not focused on the business, they're not performing. And then you have some leaders who are really focused on performance and don't have the human side of it. And to me, I say, well, you shouldn't be a leader then, because, I talk openly about this, but I'm grieving my mum, right? And that even grief has changed how I lead. Like, my compassion is on another level now, because there is nothing I've ever experienced like it. But I remember other people in my team having lost parents, and I'm like, okay, a week, call me on Monday and let me know how you're getting on. Monday, I was on the floor for at least 3 months. So leadership is so complex, right? But look, I'm sure we could go and go. We can go on. So look, you have led major transformation projects, right? Your career spans multiple different industries. You've been in finance, you've been in tech, you've done so much work, and then also you're very well studied, I have to say. And so, when it comes to change and change management and change transformation, what are organizations constantly getting wrong? What do you see when it comes to culture and inclusion? Because there's loads of things they get wrong, but when it comes to culture and inclusion and, leading people, what are they getting wrong? Where do you see the gaps?
Powerful question. And, I want to say, and I just want to kind of put this out there. I don't know who might need it, but like some people might see like my squiggly career and be like, oh, but actually it's given me so much perspective in like the way the workforce is. And so some of the common things that I see when it comes to change and some of the issues with it, and how is embedding cultural change at scale sometimes not approached the right way. So I think first thing that kind of kills change is that leadership do not understand the workforce that they have. Mm-hmm. I spoke about this in a post recently, and I said there is a difference between the authority that comes with leadership and then the power in an organization. Mm-hmm. If you're authoritative, like if you're a leader by authority, you have the authority to make things happen, but you have to quickly identify who has the power in order to resist the change and the forces against change. And so not understanding your workforce, not understanding who people are, understanding what their experiences are, understanding like the lens that they see through, and that's also translated as bias, the lens that they see through. You start to then implement change that is exclusive. It doesn't include the people. They're not considered important. And leaders need to manage that tension between different groups. Now, obviously, they have to have a strong direction and not just go with what the dominant norm is. But there has to be an understanding at least, because if someone made some change and I was like, I don't really agree with that, but you know what? They've done everything they can to understand my position and we're going to have to go with it. And they've made a principle-based decision. I might have to make my decision and be like, okay, am I with this? Am I not? But at least they've done their part, right? So this is one thing that I see. The second sort of thing that I'm going to use an analogy, and this might show my age, right? But the N64, exactly. The N64 pack, I mean, it must be Asian to some people, right? But the N64 we used to have, and they used to put a rumble pack at the end of it. And that rumble pack used to make, believe it or not, the control pad rumble. Without it, it was like you would have the encounter, but it wasn't as immersive. And sometimes that's how people try to implement change. You give this individual, or you give maybe a set of people a task to do, but they're a rumble pack. You connect them when you want, you disconnect them when you want. They don't have any budget, really. They don't really have any say. They're not embedded in a wider organizational strategy. And everything they're doing is almost seen as if like it's against what the organization is doing, and then you expect them to be the fix. That's a major problem. And then what we started to see in the last couple of months, in the last year, is some of those organizations that were set up to come and help with culture, diversity, inclusion, those roles started to fall apart because they were never embedded in your organizational strategy. And so really it should be inclusion by design. And what do I mean by inclusion by design? Like every aspect of your strategy should think, okay, well, what inclusion, what cultural aspects should we be embedded into this? And that's something that if we can start to change from the top down, you would have less of a fail in terms of change. And then I think lastly, like, it's very simple to just consult the right voices. So, you know, my diversity that I really look for, and why I didn't really like to use the word DI for a while, is it's diversity in mind. That's what we really seek out to have, because you could have all sorts of different people around the table, but if they all think the same, we've kind of just encountered the same issue, but in a different form. And we want to avoid groupthink. We want to get rid of sort of like, you know, leaders that are, you know, in a hubris kind of state where they just do what they want. Like, you want to have different perspectives, different lived experiences, and different ideologies that challenge and stress test any value proposition that you're putting out as an organization from a cultural point of view. And so I think like when companies start to look at that approach from their cultural change point of view, what you will then start to see is that, all right, we're now having a workforce that is on board. The inclusion that we are embedding into this organization and the culture we're trying to change has been wired into the organizational strategy, which means when we recruit, when we promote, when we measure performance, when we onboard suppliers, when we make decisions every single day, it is inclusive by design. Absolutely. And that's what we want to have.
Absolutely. And that is the whole premise of Illume. The whole premise of Illume was set because of that, right? It was because over the years, I have seen that we do fantastic campaigns. We do great awareness, focus groups. You know, we do an amazing Black History Month photo shoot. We have one woman on the board, and it wasn't embedded into the system. That is why we have developed the cultural governance framework. That's the language that we use. We don't talk about DEI, we talk about cultural governance. Because actually what you really want is you want to embed inclusion and culture across your whole business. Acquisitions, business growth, market growth, across all of it, right? You know, like, we are living in the most diverse world ever. 60% of the whole world identifies Asian. And so if you then think about, oh, I'm just going to see DEI from this lens, you are missing out on the whole picture. And so I completely agree with you. That's why, you know, cultural governance to us is, how do we ensure that we, embed culture and inclusion across the whole business from a governance perspective. So when you go to board and you're sitting there and you're talking about the business objectives, business growth, market acquisition, actually you're also looking at that from a cultural lens. And that's how we help, you know, a lot of organizations. And I think, to follow on from your point around where people get it wrong, I think we get it wrong because we think of it as a separate thing. You know, going back to both of our points, okay, now we're going to do inclusion, now we're going to do culture. Whereas what you've just said, you know, inclusion by design, I love that, probably will steal that, is that, you know, is that in every way you design, you know, the growth of your business, you are also thinking about it from a cultural perspective.
Yeah, super powerful.
Look, I wanted to kind of just come to this point. So at Illume, we focus on board level experiential leadership development. That for us is really important. We don't do classroom. We're not training providers. We actually take leaders on a journey through their leadership. And we've done some amazing work with amazing clients. And, you know, you have been such instrumental in kind of building, you know, what Illume is becoming very quickly. How do you actually measure whether leadership development has shifted behavior, or if it's just awareness? Because for me, you know, when we say what does good look like, I honestly believe it is about incremental behavioral change. So, you know, we don't promise in any of our, you know, leadership development that your leaders are going to be changed, you know, by one session. But what we do promise is that we will help leaders understand how they can make incremental changes, because we know that when you make incremental changes over a period of time, you change, you make a significant change. I think is there the quote that, you know, if you change by 1% every single day, by the end of the year, it's 365% of change, right? So we know that trying to change people straight away just doesn't work. And actually, to your earlier point about bias, we actually can't get rid of our biases. They're so inherent to us. But we also talk about unlearning. and we talk about the process of unlearning, and and you know, the brain is wired to be rewired. So you can rewire your brain to challenge, not to get rid of, but to challenge your biases. So I suppose, you know, I've gone a long way round, you know, but really, you know, the question that I was asking you is just, how do you measure leadership development, you know, and is it about shifting behavior? How do you shift from behavior to from awareness to just behavior?
Yeah, really powerful question. So I think, you know, quite candidly, data is really key here. And so most organizations will kind of, they will measure completion rates of training, maybe employee satisfaction scores, and you know, like, you know, your yearly, organizations call it different things, but your yearly survey, right?
Yeah, survey,
Can employees name a bias, and like, and the number of programs, and that's how we measure it. And so not just data, but the quality and the content of data is super powerful. What we really want to start seeing is, first and foremost, okay, in organizations, from a leadership point of view, and from a culture point of view, what are your employees saying about promotions? And for example, we can look at promotions by ethnicity, because that's something that's close to me. In 18 to 24 months, what is our promotion data looking like? Who gets stretch projects? Who gets, you know, when restructures happen, who gets moved here? Retention rates. What is the retention of our employees by background as well? Like, we're not just talking about like, how many people leave. Okay, how many people leave by background? Let's go to that second layer and unpick why they're leaving. You know, what are you doing in terms of your exit interviews? And then then I think the deeper level, which I've helped to embed in some organizations, is like, where are the specific stories from people that are most impacted? So, for example, worked with an organization, and after the program, it wasn't just, oh, finish the program. They sat down with the chief people officer, which they would normally not get an audience with, to present the impact of the course, right? And to show, like, okay, why is this program that's being run important? In a similar way that, you know, when we run programs with Illume, it's like, it's not just running it. What's the impact? What is the commitment of the organization? What do they seek to see after this? Because yes, it's great for awareness. Awareness is great, actually, but actually, how much more? You know, I might argue your ignorance to the matter might have been excusable, but actually, if there's no change after your awareness, it's worse. Now you're making a proactive decision to do nothing. And it's so funny, right? Because it's like, oh, what do you mean a proactive decision to do nothing? Yeah, if you do nothing, you're proactively making that decision. Like, it is a thing.
I agree.
So, you know, the behavior shifts that we want to see is not just performative because, oh, we want to tick box exercise. It's actually looking at, for example, how do we embed changes across the whole organization? When we say we measure, you know, leadership development, it's like, how we embedding that into like scorecards? What is the performance review? And how do we change the criteria and the markers so that it includes those behavior shifts that we want to see? Not from those that we're trying to develop only, but how about our existing leaders? Like, what are they showing in terms of their leadership that will make sure that they're actually having behavioral shifts? Now, the shift will only happen when leaders themselves consider themselves part of the problem rather than trying to solve the problem for people. Because if they see themselves as part of that problem, there is that imminent urgency to make the change. And it's not just, oh, it's L&D or it's, you know, HR's job to kind of make that decision and change. And no, it's the whole leadership's, you know, they're accountable to that. Like, and then you also, in anything else, once you make investments, like, you have to then define what your return on investment will be for this to make sense. And I think that's where we start to leave the room of performative and awareness, and we start to enter into the room of behavioral shift and action.
Yeah, I love that. And Ade, we could talk, you know, me and you, we could talk for hours and hours and hours. You know, we focus on leadership, not only leadership though, you know, we're working with an organization at the moment for their middle performers, right? Like, you know, our good to great program is to help middle performers understand how they can step into that kind of leadership behavior, because you don't have to be a leader to display leadership behaviors, right? And so although we work with, you know, various different levels across the business. We do want to start at the top, and we do see how critical is that. And I'm just conscious of the people that are on the line. We're going to have people from all walks of life, all different stages of their careers. If you are not a leader today, if you don't have a leadership role today, you can still inform change in your organization. You can still ask better questions. You can still ask, what are we doing about this? I've noticed this. Can we have a conversation about this? Everyone can step up and take a leadership role. However, we at Illume, especially, Illume Executive Consulting, is because at executive level, we know the power that is held there. We know the power that is held at board level. And when we see change at that level, I have seen leaders who stand up and say, I am an executive sponsor for this demographic, and I stand by this. And you see other leaders follow. You see other, baby, one more minute, please. 1 minute. You see other leaders follow. You see other people take their lead because they're seeing a leader step first.
Yeah.
And so, I suppose the message here today, as we close, Ade, is really just as a leader, you have to take accountability for your own development. If you are running a team, you have to understand, how your behaviors and your leadership traits actually influence a lot of your team members, the people that are in your team. So look, thank you so much. Do you have any final thoughts, before we close? Any final reflections?
Yeah, really powerful session about leadership, and I think it's apt to end how I started. There are leaders in title, but people who are leaders don't need a title. And what I want to kind of call out is, like, think of it about your sphere of influence. Where can you influence for change, for better, for like advancing? And on the basis that, and I always say, you need to always bring your best professional self to work, because that's what we really want to see. We don't want to see your toxic self.
Or your whole self, don't.
Bring your best professional self to work, which I think is because the workplace. We want to see leaders change and build other leaders. That's what we really need right now.
Love that. Look, Ade, thank you so much. I really appreciate you. I appreciate you in the faculty. I'm so excited. We've got a couple of things coming up in the next couple of months for our clients that we're working on together. So I'm excited to do that. Thank you for joining me this morning. And thank you for everyone. I can see in the comments, we've got a lot of comments. So sorry that we didn't get to your comments, but we will read and I will respond to all of your comments. Thank you so much, Ade. I really appreciate you, my friend. And yeah, we'll see you guys next month.
Yes.
Thank you. Okay, I think.